Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is that you're deciding to watch this podcast. I'm Ms. Shadwell. I'm going to be your U.S. history teacher. I'm very excited to be helping you through this journey. I'm sure you all may be a little bit daunted by the fact that we are starting in the 1600s and going all the way to present day. That's a lot of material to cover. So that's what I'm going to be using these podcasts for, is sort of to give you a framework and a general understanding of the material that you're about to go into with your lesson. So it's not meant to be an answer to all the questions, but to give you push in the right direction. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be looking at the 1600s, and I'm going to run this one all the way to 1763, which is the end of the French and Indian War, and that's right before we're going to start talking about the American Revolution. So that's what we're going to look at today, and that should cover basically a couple of your first lessons, so to give you a framework. So let's talk about colonization. You should already have a general understanding of Columbus and Jamestown and the colonies and how they were set up. So we're going to be looking sort of in general at the different colonies, what they had in common, and what made them different. So you can see here's a map. You've got New England colonies, middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And of course, the big thing that we're looking at here is geography. You cannot separate history from geography, especially when you're talking about colonization. So I'm just going to go ahead and write New England here. And bear with me because I'm having to get used to using this pen. New England, here we go. New England. Alright, so even if you haven't read the lessons yet dealing with colonization, you probably already know that New England is much further north, so it's going to have a colder climate. New England did not have very good soil. It was very rocky, but they did have really good ports. They had, you can look at the map here and see that there's some real good ports in here. So they're going to become more of an exporter. They're not going to really have a lot of raw material to be dealing with, but they've got all this land and some really good neighbors that they can get the material for. So they're going to be more in manufacturing. And of course, if you think about the Civil War, the North was into manufacturing, the South was into agriculture. So that's one big thing to look at is geography, and New England having ports and a colder climate, so they're going to turn to manufacturing. The middle colonies, of course, they're not as far north, but they're still going to not have as much to do with agriculture. They're going to be more with dealing with raw materials and shipping them up to places like Massachusetts, where there's a better harbor. So they have a lot of timber. They're going to ship it up north. So they do have some raw materials, but they're not going to be the planters of the South. Okay, so let's see if I can write middle colonies here. So we've got middle colonies. Middle. All right, and then of course you've got the southern colonies. Now the southern colonies, you probably are a little bit more familiar with, living in South Carolina. We are agriculture. We are going to be big into tobacco, cotton, peanuts. I mean, we just have a really great climate. But what does that mean? That means that we're also going to, in the colonies, need slaves. We don't have the manpower to do it. So where do we get the manpower? We get it from Africa. We're going to be slaves. And that's going to be called the plantation system. So you've got, I mean, except Georgia was established a little bit different. It was established as a debtor's colony. If you were rotting in a prison and couldn't pay your bills in England, you could come to Georgia. Okay, so that's a little bit about the geography of the different areas. Let's talk a little bit about who settled there. Now, of course, everyone who lives in this area, if you're looking at this area, this is all land that is owned by England. They're all considering themselves British subjects. Does that mean that everyone who lives there is English? No, there were definitely different groups of people and immigrants, but if you lived within this area, you generally were considered a British subject, even if you weren't English. Because remember, North America is being colonized by different countries. France is going to be above us, and Canada. Mexico is definitely Spanish below us. So we are a narrow little strip, and we're going to talk about the conflict that arises when we want to expand westward. Of course, there's also Native Americans there as well, and we'll talk about them at a later point. But right now we're looking at just Britain, just England, and the 13 colonies. So, who settled in New England? If you remember back, you're going to have the Puritans. Puritans were religious. They were not tolerant. They did not believe in separation of church and state. If you lived in the New England colonies, you were most definitely a Puritan. Remember that Connecticut and Massachusetts were even established by people who were kicked out of Massachusetts. Okay, middle colonies there were some Quakers here, and there were Germans, and there were some Puritans, but there's going to be a little bit more diversity in the middle colonies than there is in New England. Now, the southern colonies are going to be your most diverse. Okay, you're going to have all sorts of different religions. And again, when you read your lesson, you can look at, well, what were some of those different religions, but that's not the purpose of this lesson. I'm just sort of helping you map this out. Okay, so South Carolina is going to be your most diverse region. So what does that mean? So we've got religion, we've got your geography. What about government? Now again, remember that they all consider themselves to be royal subjects, but England's across the river, so they're going to develop differently. New England, you remember, had the Mayflower Compact. They've already got their own sort of constitution set up. The middle colonies, they're going to have Virginia, which Virginia is going to have the House of Burgess, where there's actually elected officials. So they're going to have elected officials. Okay, and then again, of course, we talked about the South, which is going to have the plantation system with the slaves. Okay, so when you read your lesson, think about what are the differences between the different colonies. What are some of the similarities between the different colonies? Okay, that's the first thing you're going to look at very briefly. So moving on, we've got colonization happening all through here, all the way up in the next date we want to start. We'll just start with 1747. We're going to jump ahead. And everybody's colonizing, everybody's working, they're trying to work out the kinks. And we're going to start, a lot of people get confused by this, but we're going to look at something called the French and Indian War. Whoa, that's really big. Now, a lot of people get confused when we talk about the French and Indian War because they think that it's the French versus the Indians. No. It is going to be Britain and the colonists against the French and the Indians. So we're looking over here. I'm going to undo that so we can see this. If you look, before the French and Indian War, this is what the North American colony looked like. You've got British colonies running here. Louisiana in yellow. This is French. This is all French, and the French are pretty friendly with the Indians because the French were set up temporary bases and not permanent colonies, so that the French and the Indians had a pretty good relationship, which is why they banded together. You've got Florida and Texas, which is going to be Spanish territory, and then the rest is undecided. So what's going to happen is basically the colonies need to expand. They want to take advantage of the Mississippi River, but they're going to come into conflict with France because France is already there. when you're looking at the French and Indian War, you want to look at, well, what are some of the conflicts? What's going to happen? Now, they basically, France and Britain did not agree on the western boundaries for the British colonies. They didn't know where the colonies ended and where France began. So they went to war with each other. Now, the French and Indian War, as you will see, the British, we won. So England defeated the French and the Indians. Now, the reason this is important is because the threat of any Western attack by the French had been removed. So now the colonists are free to expand westward. This did cause some conflict now with England, because England was worried about expansion westward. They were worried about Indian attacks, and they did not really want the colonists to expand westward. Some very important things to note that happened during this time period there was contention between England and America. For the first time, they began to feel like that England was putting too much pressure on them. They had a large war debt after the French and Indian War, and that's going to lead to some tensions later and to some causes of the American Revolution. Now, we talked about the similarities and the difference between the colonies, and each colony, of course, thinks of themselves as an individual. So if you were from New York, you considered your state to be your country. You did not really consider yourself to be a colonist, but what happened was during the French and Indian War, people from New York were fighting beside people from South Carolina. So they developed a sense of unity for the first time. That's also going to be something that's important. For the first time, they didn't see themselves as individual states. They saw themselves as more of a one country sort of thing. This cartoon of the snake down here, Join or Die, this is drawn by Benjamin Franklin, and you can see the different pieces, and of course not all the 13 colonies are represented, but this will be used again as a symbol during the American Revolution. That's why I bring it up now, but it was actually drawn during the French and Indian War to show that if the colonies were separated where they were, they wouldn't be able to fight the French and Indian threat, and they needed to join together. This is going to be used again during the American Revolution to say, you know, if they would come together, they can fight the British threat. So you've got a cartoon here, and you actually probably may have seen this cartoon in current events. It's a symbol for the recently developed Tea Party movement. So that was drawn by Benjamin Franklin. Alright, so we have this sort of expanding westward, and now we can because the French are no longer in the picture. However, now we have a problem with the British. Parliament decided that since the war had been fought on part of the colonists should bear some of the cost. Okay, and that's where the American Revolution, some of the problems that are leading into the American Revolution are going to come into play. Okay, so we've covered a very large, a lot of years and a lot of time here, and again, this is very broad, and it's broad on purpose. As you go into your lessons, this is to help you get a framework of where you are. And I will do another one on which is going to be even more intense, because we're going to do the American Revolution all the way through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So we will do that next time. I look forward to reading your lessons, and I look forward to seeing what y'all have to say. Have a good night.